Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this month's edition of the 45 in 45 minutes, which this month is being given by Frank Morgan Grant, who's a member of the 15, committee member of the 15, a member of our own association, 1745 Association, and the editor and a contributor to this book, Jacobite Folly and Dilemma, published last year to mark the 20th anniversary of the founding of the Northumbrian Jacobite Society, which looks at the Jacobite era from both sides and has a number of essays, articles, and interesting accounts of lesser known aspects of the Rising. So Frank himself is descended from veterans of the Rising. He is descended from James Francis Grant, who served at the battles of Killiecrankie and Cromdale during the Williamite Wars. That is James Francis Grant, also served at Sheriff Muir, a quarter of a century later, where he was mortally wounded, so he didn't survive that battle. Also at that battle was his son, Francis James Grant, who was just 16 at the time, but he did survive. And he also served at Lochiel in 1719, and again, quarter of a century later, he was to rise for the Prince with his younger brother. They both marched with the Prince down to Derby. They marched back with him back to Scotland, and Francis James Grant was wounded at Culloden, but he kicked over the traces successfully. He escaped down to London, and he had a normal family life, and Frank is obviously derives his family name from him. So it's with great pleasure that Frank will, I invite Frank to speak to us tonight on the subject of the Jacobites in Cumbria during their retreat from Derby back to Scotland. So he'll give an account of what they did in Westmorland and Cumberland during that period. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Francis James Morgan Grant to speak to us this evening. So Frank, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mike. And we'll just share in the hope that people can see that. I'm assuming, because I can't hear everybody, that you can see it. Thumbs up, yes, thumbs up, you can see it. Okay. I'm hoping you can only see the one slide. You don't see all the slides down the left-hand side, because I don't know how to get rid of those. So this particular talk, it's based on information that I gleaned over the years from contemporaneous notes and reports written after the event. But as you and I know, that old maxim that history is always written by the victors, it is inevitable that the Jacobite era is rife with false information, misconceived ideas about the Highland Jacobites especially, and that's really where I would like to just briefly talk, just to prove that maxim exists, but it is wrong, in that what is written is not the truth. So because I'm looking at Westmorland and Cumberland, I would like to just touch on Derby, Macclesfield and Lancashire. And what should be remembered is that from the failed 1715 uprising at Preston, local people's feelings from Lancashire, Cumberland and Westmorland were not over enthusiastic about seeing a second Jacobite army going through their county in 1745. And if you couple this with the fact that the English population at that time had been brainwashed through Whig propaganda to believe that all Highlanders were, and I quote, I'm hoping you can see that if you move your thing across. In short, they are the dregs and caput mortem of human society, fit for nothing but be thrown upon the dunghill. Or if they may be said to serve for anything, 'tis only to provoke the anger of heaven, and to be combustible stuff to kindle the general conflagration. This was written in this pamphlet, The Character of a Jacobite, in 1690. And you'll notice that the person has delightfully remained anonymous, but describes themselves as a person of quality. I'd like to question that, but nonetheless, here we have a statement. And then, of course, we come to James Ray, who we're going to talk about later. And he is a local historian from Cumberland. And he produced a book that we'll look at. And he said that he heard that the people of Cumberland and Westmorland believed that the Highland Jacobite was supposed to be cannibals. So already we have this myth about these people who are going to come through their country yet again. I'm just going to go to here now. So if we look at John Ray later, before that, we will need to look at the Scottish Historical Review of 1909. And this review is a 23-page document relating to letters written from people who lived in Macclesfield regarding the Highlanders who stayed there in 45. Many of these letters are anonymous. For example, somebody said 120 of the Highlanders were drafted out, well armed and sent off, but where no one could tell. Before they went, they paid off their quarters very justly. A very nice thing to say. Then we come to Andrew Lumsden, who was the private secretary to Prince Charles, who actually wrote a note stating, received by me as having power of the secretary to His Royal Highness Charles, Prince of Wales, paid, that's my word, to James Nixon the sum of £1 7 shillings and 7 pence as the duty of excise on ale due by him at the preceding the 15th instant. So here we have acknowledgement that beer and ale is being paid for in full. However, when we look at two other letters, anonymous, somebody wrote, the rebels stayed 2 days in their march and 2 nights in their return. The officers, for the most part, behaved pretty well. Well, that's not bad, is it? Until it goes on to say, but the common men like devils, especially in their retreat, for they not only lived upon us free quarter in every house, but pilfered and plundered people of their money, bedding clothes, and everything they could carry off. That's not so good. And then, of course, when we look at Prince Charles, when he's planning the retreat from Derby, Lord George Murray sent his brother, the Duke of Atholl, a letter in which he stated, it was past 10 o'clock before His Royal Highness left Derby, and the march was regular enough. My great difficulty was to bring up stragglers who could not be kept from going into houses and committing abuses. Of course, what Murray doesn't say is what these abuses were. Although if we wish to take into account the first writer's comments, perhaps there is nothing further to add. There are, of course, many more letters relating to the Highlanders' time in and around Derby and Macclesfield, worthy of further scrutiny, but sadly not here. So once the Highlanders had passed through Lancashire into Westmorland, heading for Kendal, they got wind that they were being pursued by government forces. They further heard that the Duke of Cumberland had instructed the deputy lieutenants of Westmorland, who were based in Kendal, to demolish Wasdale Bridge. This still stands, and it now spans the Wasdale Beck, and it is now called the Wasdale Bridge, even though it's nowhere near Wasdale. It's 3 miles north of Kendal on the Turnpike Road to Shap, which is the road that the army took. The idea of blowing the bridge up was to stop the Jacobite artillery and wagons from passing and slowing them up so that the chasing army could catch them. What should be remembered is that the main road from Shap to Penrith back then was not a road as we know it today, but it was a rough turnpike track which often flooded on the low ground, making it impassable. For example, this is a photograph of the turnpike road taken on low ground. This is a photograph taken of the same road higher up, going over to Shap. This is a drawing, 18th century drawing, of travellers on the same turnpike road. So you can see even back then, artists were trying to show that this is not a road, it's a track. And if you go into Shap, there is an interesting relic on the main street. Here we have 2 road signs here. The first one is a 19th century one. The one behind it is the original turnpike road that stood on the Shap Road inside Shap. Most have all been removed apart from this one in the bottom right-hand corner. It's at this point of our story that this gentleman comes in, and this is the Duke of Perth. The Duke of Perth, as you know, led his hussars into Kendal as a vanguard, and the idea was to head straight for Scotland so he could deliver dispatches and return to meet the main Jacobite army, ideally with reinforcements, of course, for the anticipated clash with pursuing government troops. Unfortunately, the Duke of Perth didn't even get as far as Carlisle, because between Shap and Penrith, they were attacked by government troops and repelled and actually returned back to Kendal. If we go back even before then, when the Duke of Perth entered Kendal with about 110, 120 of his hussars, around midday on Saturday, the 14th of December, 1745, the story is that when he and his hussars entered the southern parish boundary, which is here, this is this particular road, they passed through without incident until they reached Finkel Street, which is here. A local mob were hiding and suddenly fell upon them with clubs, stones, and I quote from that time, anything they could pick up in the hurry to abuse the rebels. Duke of Perth had 2 of his servants dragged off their horses and beaten so savagely that one died as a result. The hussars made a brief stand just below the fish market, which is no longer there, that's the G. But they pushed briskly forward and were pursued until they got to Stramongate Bridge, which is still there. And it was at the Stramongate Bridge that they found themselves trapped with local people behind and local people in front. A shot was fired out from a window and killed the leading hussar, straight knocked him off his horse. So they had to make another stand, and in returning fire, they actually killed 3 of the local people: Archibald Armstrong, Richard Toulman, and John Slack. It's interesting to note that in all the history books on the subject, only the names of these 3 Kendal men are named as being murdered by the rebels. Nothing about the murdered hussar or the non-combatant who was just a servant. Their names do not appear. Nobody knows who they are. Biased reporting or what? In the end, the Duke of Perth's men managed to get out of the town, and they took several local prisoners along the way, and they headed for Shap before going on to Carlisle via Penrith. These events were witnessed by a Kendal man, a Henry Holmes. Henry Holmes, with 5 other Kendal residents, followed the hussars at a safe distance to see what they were getting up to. And once they were spotted, they fled in terror when the Hussars fired off several shots in their direction. Later, Holmes wrote a report stating that as they made their way from Kendal to Penrith, this is the Highlanders, they were plundering all before them, took all the horses, hay, corn, or anything else they could meet with, and that the poor people at Shap, Thrimby and Strickland has not so much as a little bread. In addition to this, he also went on to say that they took horses and livestock, forcing entry into houses, taking all the food along with souvenirs. Now, it's at this point that it beholds us to take a brief look at some interesting points regarding Holmes's accusations. The first point is that Holmes later admitted that most of his information of the Highlanders looting, plundering, and treating the local people roughly was not observed by him, but was obtained much later in 1746, once all the local unrest was over, and he wandered the Jacobites' northern retreat route to Penrith, speaking to the local population about their ordeal. Make of that what you will. The second point of interest is that the Jacobite army were aware that pursuing their rear guard were fast-moving light horse government troops, and it is hardly likely that they would bother themselves to stop off at all the farmhouses to collect provisions and souvenirs. They were actually already given bread before they left Kendal, so they had enough food to get to Shap. And when they got to Shap, most of them spent the night there. They didn't need to plunder because they were billeted in Shap. This brings us to another contemporaneous report. As mentioned earlier, it was our James Ray, and he wrote this pamphlet, A Complete History of the Rebellion from its first rise to its total suppression as the glorious Battle of Culloden in April 1746. Now, what's interesting about James Ray is that he was from Whitehaven in Cumberland, and in the autumn of 1745, he made his way to Carlisle to join the royal garrison to defend the walled city and castle from the Jacobite army, who he heard was marching down from Edinburgh. When he got to Carlisle, he found out that the castle had surrendered to the Jacobites. So he followed the Jacobite army south to Derby, taking notes along the way. He later gave these to the Duke of Cumberland when he met him on the 5th of January, 1746, at Stafford. Following this meeting between Ray and Cumberland, Ray hurried off to follow the Jacobite army north as they continued their retreat. He kept sending reports back to the Duke of Cumberland. If anyone could or should have written anti-Jacobite reports, true or not, surely it would have been him. But it wasn't. In his book, Ray presents quite a different picture of the Highlanders when he states that on entering Penrith on their way south, the Highlanders were courteous to the townspeople and paid due respect to the female gender. He also said, as the retreating Jacobite army entered Kendal, they were assaulted with clubs, stones, sticks, amid verbal abuse. He also went on to say, as the Highlanders left Shap, making for Penrith, they neither molested the country people, nor were they molested by them. So this really brings us to the conclusion that either one of these stories is right, by Holmes or by Ray, and the other a falsehood, or perhaps they're both right. Perhaps there's a little bit of truth in both of them. Whatever that happens to be, it brings us to the gentleman here, of course, Prince Charles, who stayed the night at Shap before going on to Carlisle. He stayed at a local hostelry called West Farm, which is now demolished. He occupied an upstairs room above the front door. It was said by the landlady after he left that the following morning, the prince complained about the hefty bill she gave him to pay, which was for ale, wine and other provisions, £4 17 shillings, plus £2 2 shillings for the use of the house, coming to £6 19. When you compare the prince's cost to that of David Morgan, an officer in the Manchester Regiment, who a week earlier had stayed in similar accommodation in Derby, paying £2 4 shillings for an evening meal, bed and breakfast, one can only come to the conclusion that it was a case of the landlady saw the prince coming. Nonetheless, the prince is viewed as mean rather than the landlady fleecing him. So once the Jacobite army had left Shap, we all know that they arrived at Clifton Bridge. And when you delve into the reports written on both sides about the Clifton skirmish, it becomes clear that neither side behaved according to any rules of decency with regards to engaging with enemy, which time here sadly does not allow us to actually go into. We all know that later the main Jacobite army made for Carlisle and the safety of the castle, which they still held at the time. And this is a contemporaneous print of what the castle looked like at the time. However, not all made their way directly to Carlisle, because a group of Highlanders decided to go somewhere else. And they left Penrith and made for a village called Dalston. Dalston is southwest of Carlisle. Carlisle is the purple dot above rear there. And they made their way there for one reason only. And that is because they'd heard that this place, Rose Castle, being their target, which was the main residence of Sir George le Fleming, the Bishop of Carlisle, and their target and his place was his collection of silverware. When the bishop was not at home when these events took place, but his daughter, Catherine D'Arcy Appleby, was. And due to the turbulent times, and she was expecting her third child, she had been advised to spend the last days of her confinement at Rose Castle so that the baby could be baptized immediately after the birth by the bishop's chaplain, who also resided at the castle. Catherine's husband was Joseph Appleby D'Arcy of Kirklington Hall, north of Carlisle, and he was an officer in the Hanoverian army, but was captured after Carlisle Castle had fallen to the Jacobite army, and was still in the castle dungeons. On further investigation, the tower on your left is the main dungeons, if you like, the main cells, but they were full of Highlanders, over 300 of them at the time. So he was put in what's called the moat dungeon, which is the blue arrow. The moat is dry now, but in those days it was full. The moat prisons have open windows. So he was freezing, he was cold, damp. And the reason that he was put there and not housed in the abbey, the cathedral, who took some of the officer prisoners and some of the other main houses, if you like, was that he was so important to be kept a prisoner that if he'd escaped to get back to Rose Castle, that would be a rallying point. So they kept him in the dungeon. This is the reason that his wife was at Rose Castle alone. So we come to the question, who were these Highlanders? And what did they actually do when they got there? Well, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. There are some records that say Captain MacDonald of Tiendrish led the group. There are other documents that say Major MacDonald of Tiendrish led the group. There are some documents that say Captain MacDonald, don't say where he comes from, led the group. But whoever he was a MacDonald. And he led his men to the main gate. This is a contemporary photograph. This is the main gate, which is still there. He got to the main gate, and just as he pushed the gates open, an elderly grey-haired servant ran down the drive to entreat them not to proceed any further, as a lady had just gone into labour. And there were fears that noise and alarm, might occasion the death of both the lady and the child. So Captain MacDonald inquired when the lady had been confined and was told by the servant within this hour, at which point he stopped his men. Not wishing to let the moment slip by, the servant added, "They are just going to christen the infant." At this news, MacDonald, taking off his cockade, and this is the cockade, holding it out in front of him, said to the servant, "Let her be christened with this cockade in her cap. It will be her protection now and after if any of our stragglers should come this way. We will await the ceremony in silence." Which is what they did. The child was christened Rosemary D'Arcy. Now, this story was not written by the victors. It wasn't written by anybody in Carlisle. It wasn't written by any Whigs or anybody else. This story did not come to light until 1817, when Rosemary, 72 years of age, still having the cockade that she was given as a baby, sent her story into Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, and they printed it in the September 1817 one. In this document, she praised the behaviour of the Highlanders, saying that their manners were impeccable and appropriate, and that they gave her mother and her servants the respect that was asked of them. In addition, she wrote, "I send you some account of the particulars that attended my birth, which I do with infinite pleasure, as it reflects great honour of the Highlanders, to whom I always feel the greatest gratitude, that at the time when their hearts were set on plunder, the fear of hurting a sick lady and a child instantly stopped their intentions." She goes on to say, "My white cockade was safely preserved for me and shown to me from time to time, always reminding me to respect the Scotch." That's a good drink, but we know what she means. And the Highlanders in particular. "I think I have obeyed the injunction by spending my life in Scotland and also by hoping at last to die there." And she signs it, Rosemary Clark Nee D'Arcy. As a young lady, she married this gentleman when she was 32. He is John Clerk, a Scots officer in the Navy and heir to the baronetcy of Pennycook. What is interesting regarding this event is that Captain MacDonald was taken prisoner and sentenced to death at Carlisle. And yet there does not appear to be any appeal by the D'Arcy family for clemency, because on the 18th of October, 1746, he was duly hung, drawn and quartered on Harrowby Hill by William Stout, a Hexham resident, in not a nice manner. So when you look at just these brief few things, and it is just a brief few things, one has to say, if you read all the anti-Jacobite reports, they paint the Jacobites in a negative light. And the odd few who don't paint them in this dark light tend to be ignored in future books. Now, I'd like to spend another hour talking to you really about the executions in Carlisle, Brampton and Penrith, but we don't have the time. I'd like to talk about William Stout, why he was chosen to execute these men when he was an illiterate labourer who had no idea what he was doing and caused them great pain. I'd also like to tell you, over 5 years, I have been trying to find the exact location where they were executed in Penrith, because nobody knows, because it was never recorded. I have to say now that I'm virtually there because I know the field. I have the field already identified, and hopefully this weekend when I go for a return visit, I'll be able to pinpoint the exact spot that those Highlanders were executed in Penrith. So it was a brief talk, but I want to thank you for your time and your patience. And if you're interested to know, that's the bibliography that I got most of this information from. Thank you for your time.